thank you all for braving the rain, the United Nations, traffic coming here. So we're very excited you're all able to make it. I'm Danielle Ofri. I'm the editor-in-chief of Bellevue Literary Review, and I'm so pleased to welcome you here to the wonderful, fabulous New York Academy of Medicine. If you don't know NIM, you should really check it out. It's an amazing organization with a gorgeous library, an even more gorgeous rare book room. So when you have a chance, maybe Connor will let us know how you can get to visit at some point. Not tonight, but another night. Tonight's event is called Reading the Body, Dialogues and Creativity and Healing. And this is a really interesting kind of combination of things and how this came to be. So this is jointly sponsored by Bellevue Literary Review, BLR, and the Paige Fraser-Hoffman Foundation, TPFF. And TPFF focuses on the arts, particularly in dance, but all art forms, and BLR is a literary journal about health, illness, and healing, creative writing. And we thought, how do we get the written word off the page? And so we thought about this. This was during the pandemic, our first Reading the Body venture, where we took 4 poems, and our first one was on disability, and this year's one that you'll see tonight is on recovery. We took 4 wonderful poems from BLR and handed them to 4 fabulous dancers and asked them to create something with it that expresses the poem in dance form. And then we had wonderful commissioned music, and our composer, can you just raise your hand, Daryl? Our composer, who is a jack of all trades composed original music for the film. We had a professional actor narrating, an ASL interpreter, a wonderful film crew, you'll see them around, who created the film. And we put together this Reading the Body the film that has 4 parts, 1 for each poem. And you'll see the poem, you'll hear it, you'll see it signed, you'll see it danced. And so we've created a film short. It's under 20 minutes, and it was an amazing film. And I have to say, as of today, it's an official selection of 6 international and national film festivals, including a win of the Kiez Berlin Film Festival. It's in a film festival in Italy, in the UK, and several in the US, and we're just getting started. So this is our debut live filming screening, and it's been so nice to bring everyone together in person. In the past, we've done them online, which is wonderful, but this offers something else. And so tonight we'll show the film, and then after the film we'll have a panel. You'll get to meet some wonderful panelists, and we'll have a conversation about creativity and healing, which will involve you, the audience. So we're hoping you will start saving up your questions. Enjoy the film, and we'll meet you back here in about 15, 18 minutes.
I recently lost a relative that was very close to me, and it was very sudden, and of course took a few days off to process and go through that, but it's so in our nature as artists to keep going. My piece will definitely be tapping into the process of recovering through grief, through loss, and also accepting that person is still with me and just in a different way.
After nearly 7 years clean. I don't know how I did it. Loved you all those years in the quiet landscape of a burning vineyard, of a toppling mountain, of a drowned seascape, and had stayed attentive, at ease, hands behind my back, waiting for the soft hook following go, and the on and on insanity of day after day, of the hand reaching for the other hand, shaking it for its own pleasure, checking for the rhythmic music of my own pulse. And I don't know how I lived for myself, all those years lying on the cold surface of a man's bed, claiming Messiah, flesh of my flesh, and the steam of golden light escaping from him. I can't resist you. That velvet head lying on my chest, soft breath, and the unprotected extension of my hand to your bulging hand, non-sated, hungry and never really safe. I sit and think of you, our joist, our spar to spar, our never-ending, and our last hour where you couldn't comfort me.
I usually make works that try to facilitate welcoming and create images of freedom. Recovery to me means that I get to take time to assess where my body is. The one thing that I'm really excited about with recovery and my journey in recovery is vacation. I think that I didn't realize that getting time and space away, even though I could recover at home and with family and loved ones, there's still a process of getting away that has really restored me through my process as a dancer.
When it smells like rain, I know that you are coming. Can feel your proximity and your intentions. My world is colored by the threat and your impulses. And so I brace myself. I want to crawl back into my warm bed and remember yesterday and there in the before when I was able and steady on my feet, ready to run. And now I'm not so sure. Perhaps there should be another word for depression. We've become too accustomed to the sound, the pressing together of its consonants and vowels against our tongue and teeth. There should be something more formidable in its place, for a thing that makes you forget yourself, dirties each stream you drink from, blows away the footprints of every road you have ever walked down until you become terrified that you'll never find the way back. There is no God here, or Black Jesus, and the light is hard to come by. So you walk forward, stumbling in the dark, feeling at walls that are no longer there. Because someone once told you you had to, have to, every time. Retrace your footsteps and then find the way back home.
recovery is important because there needs to be time and space to heal and transparency. And for me to have that honesty and vulnerability and availability to have that space and consciously check in with myself of what I emotionally need, physically need, and the support I can get around me to sustain my body and my mind and my spirit.
The playground has been locked for months. A swing coughs dryly in the shade. Each night ambulances pulse through our sleep. Long white corridors crowd our dreams. Remember the scent of new grass in the park, of earth clotting in the rain? Remember the picnickers laughing beside the magnolia's soft pink lungs? Now we distrust even the breeze, and only the birds will congregate. The smallest gesture has grown grand, and from afar we've learned to love our neighbor's song. Our voices kiss the walls. Because we cannot, the tulip breathes.
Recovery means rebirth and a constant regeneration. It's the up, and then it's the down, and then the getting back up. It's the rise and the fall. Those challenges are our blessings and lessons, and so the pain and the hurt is only an opportunity for us to come back stronger. And so I really appreciate recovery. I appreciate how people show up through the act of recovery. It's an opportunity to accept the newness of every moment.
From water. Since the fall, summer's shade bristles on the canyon floor, and I must press my lips to the fault line, that fissure where each drink weeps slowly out the back of my skull. I'd like to lie, to play Moses and strike a miracle out of stone, but most days, all I can do is wander through smog and dust, trying to remember a wave's direction. I follow you now. 3 years in, and you've learned how to be in this state of lateness, this post-concussion syndrome. Like a ghost, you say. Like the soul, it never quite shows up on an MRI. But here we are, just out of focus and keeping faith. You take my arm and remind me which way to walk the fire road home. How strange to be this soft, to look down an ammonite circling into concrete and return to this question of one's final shape. The final shape will be shale, a metacarpal or two, to point the way to fossil reefs, the mollusks I imagine as ossicles listening in the rock for some hand to bridge the shores on our canyon wall. But you were never the type to walk among these alders, their coral of split gills, and find yourself in just the shallow end of eternity. Never that romantic. You know drowning is as much a predicament of time as water. Soon winter will lift the fall to its surface like a leaf on a stream, and there'll be months to stay in and write a single poem. Soon the muscle will work toward something dry and hard enough to keep. To worry the blade of a seismograph as these songs of whales held in our mountains like a breath.
So thank you all for coming. What I'm actually going to do is just ask each person to introduce themselves, just briefly tell us who you are and kind of how you came to where you are. So Lucy, I'll let you start first.
Oh, thank you. Well, I'm so excited to be here, and my name is Lucy Hutner. I am a psychiatrist here in New York City. I'm mostly, actually about 95% of the time, I focus on women's mental health, so I work with preconception, pregnancy, and postpartum the vast majority of the time. And I suppose I got to this place because I actually am a former dancer myself. Prior to medical school for about 7 years, I danced professionally out in San Francisco, and then kind of reluctantly went to medical school and ended up a psychiatrist, and here I am.
Well, thank you. And Paige, I'd love you to introduce yourself and tell us a bit about the Paige Fraser Foundation.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name's Paige Fraser-Hoffman. I am the Chief Artistic Director and Program Director for Dance at the Paige Fraser Foundation. TPFF was founded in 2017 by Lesma Fraser. It's a Bronx-based arts nonprofit organization. And we originally started with programs for dance, and since then have expanded, offering programs in theater, visual arts, music, wellness, dance, of course. And we now offer programs not only in the Bronx, but one of our programs, Spine Series, which I'm a scoliosis advocate. I was diagnosed with scoliosis at the age of 13, which inspired the creation of the Paige Fraser Foundation, how I was able to persevere with a professional career in dance despite that physical challenge. So one of our programs, Spine Series, although we are a Bronx-based organization, has allowed us to reach many, many different countries because during the pandemic, we were able to offer that program on Zoom. So we really are reaching a lot of people and also now expanding beyond just youth. Some of our programs are for adults as well. I think that's it for now.
And can you just tell us your day job?
My day job, I am the dance captain, one of the dance captains in a swing in The Lion King on Broadway. I originally started on the tour in 2019. I actually just celebrated 4 years of being with the company. And after the pandemic, they promoted me to dance captain. So I'm responsible for knowing 12 different tracks from beginning to end of the show. I can jump in and be thrown into the show at any moment. And I also help keep the integrity of the show, running rehearsals and getting people into the show. So I wear many hats.
Right.
Yes.
And also, if you were in Chicago this summer, Paige did a short little stint in West Side Story at the Lyric Opera, which my daughter got to see and enjoyed very much. Jeremy, I'm just going to toot his horn a little bit, has a new book coming out called Project Unlonely, being published next week, right? 2 weeks? October 3rd. And you can join us. We'll be working together for his book launch at the Powerhouse Arena on October 4th. All right, Jeremy, introduce yourself.
It's great to start with a plug for my book. Thanks.
Of course.
Danielle. I'm Jeremy Nobel, and it's a pleasure to be here this evening exploring this wonderful topic. I'm an internal medicine physician, also a poet, and I started and lead the Foundation for Art and Healing. We're a nonprofit organization. We've been around almost 20 years, and our mission is to explore and promote creative expression as a path to health and well-being for individuals and community. This book that Danielle so kindly promoted actually really relates to one of the main focuses of the foundation, which is to use the arts to connect, to address loneliness and social isolation, which was an issue long before the pandemic. And so a lot of our work now at the foundation is through an initiative called Project Unlonely. And it's got 3 goals. One is to increase awareness of loneliness and its toxicity. The second is to reduce the stigma that surrounds it. For some people, it's hard to even say the word lonely. And the third is to design and make available creative expression-based programming so people can have the sense of connection that the arts can offer.
Thank you so much. And so I'd like to maybe just start with some reflections on the film. So Lucy, this is the first time you've seen. I'm just wondering what comes to mind for you.
Well, a lot came up when I was watching this film. I'll tell you a little vignette about what happened when I transitioned from being a dancer, a modern dancer, which I was really all of my life and all the way through college and after college, again, for about 7 years. And when I entered medical school, I just remember thinking, oh my God, they actually want me to talk? And now I have to express myself verbally. And then, of course, when I became a psychiatrist, there was even more talking. And I think that in many ways, I actually think that this film, watching it, brought up, to be honest, the major word that came to mind was jarring. Because when I think of at least my own personal journey throughout medical school, residency, fellowship, faculty, and now in practice, one of the things that I found personally jarring and I had to kind of come to terms with, and it was difficult to come to terms with, are all of the adjectives that end up on one side and all of the adjectives that end up on the other side. So for example, when I see the title of healing, creativity, when I heard them speaking and dancing about time, grief, recovery, these are, I have to say, I don't think, there are other psychiatrists here in the audience, I don't think I ever heard any of those terms really once at all during any of my training at all. What we hear the vast majority of the time is instead of creating, we're analyzing. Instead of healing, we're fixing. And there's nothing wrong with that in many ways. I enjoy being a physician, I enjoy being a psychiatrist, but it's very much of one type of way of thinking. And that way of thinking can be very, very, very powerful, but it is jarring to realize and try to pull together different ways of thinking. So that was sort of my major takeaway from the film. I think that, however, one way that I've pulled together those two different ways of thinking is that when I think about what my patients have always wanted, and when I think about what I think people come to doctors for, it's really to be seen, to be heard, to have their story understood. And so actually, I have sort of moved much more away from this sort of hyper-analytical, fix-it mentality that I was trained with and that I do appreciate, and much more into taking time to really hear the story, slow down, and pull together a narrative.
Thank you, Lucy. Paige, you were a dancer performer in the film. Can you share with us what is it like to take words on a page and translate them into a nonverbal art form?
I actually enjoy that process. I think just because when you start dance at a young age, your teachers use words, or ideas. Be a princess, or you're running from a scary mouse, when I was doing Nutcracker. So those practices and those prompts have been embedded in me since I was young. So it's actually very easy for me to use description and words to kind of direct and guide my movement vocabulary. It's easier than just pulling from nothing. And I also love using life experiences. And unfortunately, around the same time of filming this project, I lost my sister-in-law. So I was able to pull from that experience, even though it was still very fresh. It was something that I was able to use within the movement. And similar to what you were saying in terms of growing up not having to speak, or not having to speak, because in dance, especially as a kid, you go into the studio, your teacher's saying, be quiet, it's very focused. The one who's talking is usually the one who gets kicked out of the class. So, growing up being a young dancer and just having that discipline and focus, I think for me, when I started branching out into musical theater, and being in that atmosphere and being around actors and singers who had been using their voice for as long as I had been using my body, it's now poured into my process as a performer of not being apologetic with choices that I make with my body and now my voice as a triple threat artist. But I think this year, what was great, the first film we did during the pandemic, we also pulled from the poetry. But what was so special about this year is all the dancers were in the same space. And we were able to sit in and watch each dancer as they processed the poem, the movement, and the music. So it really was beautiful to feel connected in that way and see how we each interpreted recovery differently. As you can see, it's very different approaches. And I think that's what's so beautiful about dance.
Yeah, our Paige is referring to our first Reading the Body on Disability. Because during the pandemic, each dancer filmed in their own home or their own space, and then we just pulled those films together. So it was a very different filming experience. And before I go to you, Jeremy, my observations on the film, it's in some ways a very dark film. It's filmed a little darkly. And recovery, you often think of that's going into the light. But before you get there, there is a long, dark part. And how we came to the theme of recovery was that every fall, BLR has a sub-theme. Our main themes are illness, health, and healing. But that fall, our theme was recovery. But given the cycle time for getting an issue into production and getting the stuff out, so it takes 2 to 3 years when you first have to put out the call for submissions. So we chose the theme of recovery well before the pandemic was even, we were thinking, drug addiction, health, yada, yada. And then, of course, in came the pandemic. So as we're getting all the submissions, the tenor changed. And it went from what we thought of recovery to now dealing with this sort of community-wide recovery or lack thereof. And when I was a resident, I took class at the Martha Graham Studio uptown. And it was a really interesting contrast to spend the day in the hospital with people who were very, very sick, and then to go, and a decidedly not a beautiful place. It's just really, beauty doesn't have a lot of shrift in medicine. And then I would go run uptown to the Graham studio, it used to be on 63rd Street, and it was all about beauty, which was this very odd contrast, that people cared so much about, that we all get on this angle together. And it was really a fascinating contrast to see, because in some way, beauty is useless, right? What is the point of beauty, right? Doesn't cure a patient, doesn't win a grant, doesn't, change the world, nothing really. It's impractical. But the impracticality of it was sort of what was so appealing. Yes, it's impractical, and then let's go for it anyway. And that's kind of this freeing thing. And so the theme of recovery, of just going for that beauty and the aesthetic without it having to be practical, was really what struck home for me. And Jeremy, I'm not sure if you trained in dance, maybe you're going to have to do a little soft shoe routine for us. What was your take on the film?
Well, I love so many aspects of the film. I didn't train in dance, but I did train in poetry. So to actually watch poetry be interpreted, expressed, experienced through movement was incredible. And it particularly around the theme of recovery. So I'm actually I put a book of poetry about recovery aside to write this book on loneliness because it seemed more urgent. But I'm going to come back, so I hope BLR does another edition on recovery. But what I also thought was very moving about the film was the recognition that there is an isolation about recovery, just like there's an isolation about illness. When you are, particularly if you're seriously ill, it is a journey through loneliness in many ways. And so the struggle of recovery in many ways is a struggle to reconnect to other people, but also to yourself, because your sense of self gets so distorted in any kind of illness.
I think that's very, very true. I'm going to let the audience know that there's a microphone there, and you're welcome to get up at any point. You don't have to wait till the end. I'm going to ask another round of questions, but think of yours and come on and jump up. I'm happy to call on you. Just please either wait for the mic or get up. Do you have a question? You want to go grab the mic and you can be our first questioner?
First of all, thank you for this program. It was really wonderful and inspiring and eye-opening. I was particularly moved after seeing the different interpretations of recovery, from one who looked like they were being pushed around and blown around and not in control, one who seemed very strong, everyone sort of reinterpreting it in a different way. But for me, one of the most beautiful moments came when all four were together. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's an important part. Just as you said, illness is a lonely experience, and certainly coming after the pandemic, and we have to admit, we were in a pandemic and we were lonely. The concept of being able to touch another hand, mm-hmm. to look in someone's face and be there, I thought was incredibly meaningful, and I appreciate it very much. And one more thing I just want to add is about poetry, which I love. I was an English teacher and all before I went to medical school, and the most difficult thing was learning how to read a medical textbook, which has no poetry at all. It's like, they drained every beautiful word out of the language and put it in a book. Yeah. All right. So I think that, and all of us here know, the power of a smile. The power, we saw that in the pandemic when nurses ended up, and doctors, painting a smile on the mask, just so that someone could see that there was a humanity that was in front of them. So it's not meaningless and it's not worthless for healing. The smile and the touch, it's, the laying on of hands. It's a beautiful thing, and it's part of healing. So kudos to all of you. I'm really very grateful.
Thank you so very much.
Can I say something?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to say something in response to that wonderful comment. One of the things I was thinking about, Danielle, when you said the idea of beauty, and coincidentally, I trained at the Graham School instead of my grandmother, so I have a lot of connections to the Graham School. When I think of what I loved about dance, it is the sense that the beauty is coming from the integration of our minds, our bodies, and I would actually even say our soul, is all in one unit. And I think that for me, that's where the beauty is coming from. And it's interesting because when we read a medical textbook or anything that's drained of that beauty, I do think that some of that comes from the fact that in medicine, our job is to break everything down into silos and break everything down into sort of disconnected parts. That's sort of the foundation of Western medicine, and whether we agree with that or not, it has it's sort of like all the beauty, imagination, and creativity just falls out when we do that. And I think there's something really beautiful, and I think we saw this in this film, where the recovery process, to me, is about integration, and I think that's where the healing comes in.
Yeah, the thing is, it wasn't always so. I mean, here we are in this historical building, and if you look back at our older medical textbooks, Sir William Osler and the musicality of murmurs, we use lots of metaphorical language that has changed as we've had more scientific knowledge, kind of had a little bit of an asymptote of how the language and our knowledge went. In some senses will make sense. We now can understand the murmur. We don't need to describe it in the way it flows. We can actually get an echo and just give the velocity across the valve. And so we've sort of drained, if you pick, anyone who's a doctor, just pick a random journal out of your pocket and open it up and just read a paragraph. It really kind of sticks in your throat. Our hospital cafeteria, when we had one, everyone was from the South, so they always served grits, which was an odd thing for New York City people, but the grits, Barry remembers, but they would stick in your throat, and I feel like a lot of our medical textbooks, you read them, it's kind of like reminds of those grits, but you could not grow a single staphylococcal organism on any medical textbook today. But one of the fun things to go back to the older textbooks and the descriptions of how we describe it, like in medicine, we have a fixation on fruit, right? We have a grapefruit-sized tumor, an almond-sized thing, and everything is a fruit melon size, as though we've never heard of a ruler, but we want to compare it to fruit. And we have a lot of gastronomical, cinnamon things and cherry things. We really love our food. Jeremy, I want to circle back to you because we talked a little bit about how illness is so primally lonely. And I thought that Paige's image in the film on the mirror reminded me of those COVID days when you really could only sort of touch the window. We had so much of that in the hospital and in nursing homes, and how poignant that was. You couldn't actually touch the person. But COVID just really brought out what was fundamentally always there. No matter how many people you have around you, you're still alone in your illness, right? You can never have anyone really know what it's like to have your experience. And no matter how caring your team is and your family is, you're the one who is sick, and there's just a primal loneliness. And the idea of being unlonely, it's a neologism, a new word. Why did you choose the term unlonely as opposed to together, some other opposite of loneliness?
Well, it goes to a really important observation I made about the power of the word lonely and how it has a psychic weight to it. And so when we were thinking about what our initiative should be called that was going to address loneliness, we thought about all the alternative words, together, togetherness, connected. None of them had the emotional valence, the emotional weight to be a counterbalance to the negativity emotionally of loneliness. So I actually was doing a poetry workshop in California, and Bob Hass, a two-time poet laureate, was holding it. And I said, Bob, okay, so I want to work on loneliness, and I want to actually get people's attention. What do you think of the word unlonely? So he thought for a while, as poets do, and he said, I think that's a good word. So we went with loneliness, and what we're actually doing is we're rebranding a word to have, and everyone knows what unlonely means. We don't have to explain it to anyone. It's actually been around since the 15th century, by the way. It's not a neologism. It's just not often used.
Does it have a hyphen?
No hyphen. We actually capitalize the L to create more of a distinction graphically on it. But people know what it means, and it gets their curiosity. And there are very few things that work as powerfully against despair as curiosity. It's really a wonderful way in to despair. And so we thought, start with a word that makes people curious. So that's kind of the background. And now Jason Mraz has a song out called Unlonely. John Prine, actually, if you dig in, he actually had a song on Unlonely 10 years ago. So it's out there. But we're hoping people just find it a useful word to move towards that has that emotional weight to the positive that lonely has to the negative. But we'll see how it goes.
Fantastic. So Lucy, I was going to maybe pose this question to you. You know, we're thinking about recovery. We often think about individuals who recover. But the pandemic has been this sort of community, this communal sort of experience and potentially, hopefully, a communal recovery. And I'm wondering in your practice, I mean, right now, you cannot get a psychiatrist in New York City or a therapist. Like the waiting list, everyone is anxious and lonely. My patients are all frustrated. They call every number, and every therapist is booked till like 2050. So you probably have a front seat into how people are feeling about how we move toward recovery. What does it mean to recover as a community?
That is a really great question.
If we can, if it's even possible.
I'll start again with an anecdote because one of the things that I was involved in quite a lot during the pandemic was in the early days of the pandemic in New York City. There was a mandate that all people who were giving birth in any New York City hospital had to give birth entirely alone, without their partner if they had one, or a spouse if they had one, no support person, no doula, nobody. They were supposed to just go into a hospital and give birth alone. And, right, that just feels really wrong. I mean, not only does it go against World Health Organization guidelines for good reasons that someone should have labor support 24 hours a day, but it just feels wrong to us because it feels like during one of the most transformative, physically, mentally, and emotionally challenging times of a person's life, they really should never be alone for that at all. And so I think that I would say that, I'm a co-founder of a startup that's a digital roadmap for pregnancy and postpartum, and I will say that one of the most wonderful things that we were able to do was create a virtual doula chain for anybody who is giving birth in the city of New York during that time. So all of our doulas who were really wonderful, they're like, sure, I'll take care of a patient for 8 hours on FaceTime, I don't mind. And so we knew that all of the people who were in our organization were never going to give birth alone. So we felt really good about that. And then eventually the governor came down and basically reversed and set up an executive order and reversed that mandate. What I would say about that is I think that that's an example of, in my practice, it's not the only time that external events had such a profound effect on my practice's mental health, but aside from politics, I would say that the pandemic I would say it affected 100% of my patients in a very profound way. It was actually very interesting. I would say a couple of things about this. Patients who were in my practice who had struggled with fairly significant mental health conditions before actually got through it a little bit more easily than some of my other patients. And part of it, they were like, hey, there's a lot that's out of our control. Hey, sometimes things happen that are just like completely random and that we can't predict, and right? And so actually it was really fascinating. And some of my patients who on the surface were a bit more higher functioning, they really had a hard time because they were used to having a lot of autonomy and control in their life, and then suddenly the entire infrastructure of their life was ripped apart. and they really had a hard time with very severe panic, a lot of anxiety. I mean, I was flooded, so was everybody else. I think, and again, side note, you can't be a women's mental health psychiatrist without being very aware of social constructs. So truthfully, the ability to work remotely is actually a boon for many working parents. So I will say that was a good effect of the pandemic. I would say that recovery is going to take a long time because it was a collective trauma that I still think we're sort of meandering out of, but it doesn't seem like yet there's the type of active coming together. It seems like we're all sort of like, kind of just meandering our way out of it. I think that to me, collective recovery would go again to the idea of connection and thinking through, okay, so again, as a women's mental health psychiatrist, I think to myself, why did the rates of postpartum depression go from unacceptably high, 15%, to 35% in the pandemic? Why was that? And when we think about that, it goes back to the idea of social isolation, disconnectedness, lack of ability to access mental health support, all sorts of things. And to that end, then we think to ourselves, okay, there are solutions there. We just have to find them. One of the things that we did when I co-founded our company, Phoebe, is that after about 1,000 times of hearing how disastrous the postpartum period was, we decided to make a solution about it. And the only reason why I give that as an example is because in the postpartum period, it is absolutely crucial to have connection. We cannot do it ourselves. It's impossible. And so what we did is we created teams of people who were all due to give birth at roughly the same time, and we surrounded them with teams of experts, and they all give birth as a team. And they're all connected digitally, they're all on WhatsApp. It's actually really, really, really fun. And one of the things that was the most meaningful thing that someone said to me after they had joined Phoebe was, I thought I was going to have severe postpartum depression, but I knew I had a safety net. I knew I had people who cared about me and who were willing to find what I needed and get the information I needed, and I knew I was going to do this by myself. And I really think that goes back to the idea of there's so much that we can't do alone. It goes back to really, I think, fundamentally questioning the premise of our culture, our highly individualistic culture. I've just gotten to a point where I'm like, I just don't think we can do it alone. I really don't.
Yes, well, we say the team. I'm imagining the labor and delivery floor when the whole team gives birth at the same time. As one busy ward. I was actually making the comparison. We just passed the anniversary of 9/11. Yeah. Which for very people similar. Who live in New York, was quite intense. Certainly in the hospitals, it was very intense. And I remember our chief talking to us and saying, this is going to be psychiatrically or psychologically affecting people, for years to come. Yeah. It's going to be a profound thing. And in some ways, it turned out not to be, interestingly. We had a way of recovering from that event. And the pandemic does feel different because that was even more extrinsic. The pandemic, we sort of play a role in it, right? And how we fracture or come together, how we spread or don't spread it. But because it had an impact, I think, on everyone's daily life, whereas 9/11 was still, if you weren't around ground zero, literally if you were on 59th Street, it wasn't such a big issue for you. But this thing sort of coming together, what I just found fascinating. Mm-hmm. And Jeremy, I'm wondering, in your practice, what do you see about sort of the community-wide recovery? Is that even possible?
I think it is possible, but we also have to remind ourselves, that not just the pandemic, but also any major trauma. Mm-hmm. You probably heard the phrase, same storm, different boats. Right. People who are already marginalized for a variety of reasons, because of poverty, race, discrimination, are already struggling to be connected. And so then we have the pandemic, and the people who had the resources actually could stay at work through hybrid connection. Other people had to show up service jobs and so on. Very high illness rates. Their families got sick too. So there's a deep trauma that's not equally distributed in our communities. And I think the first thing we need to do is say that out loud and recognize that, the intersectionality of people who are already at risk. And it's a bigger social problem than just recovery from the pandemic, obviously.
Right. So, Paige, I imagine in the world of dance, recovery is a thing you deal with all the time. Maybe you can talk a little bit about how the recovery's been as a community.
Yeah, it's interesting. I keep thinking about the word rest because as performers, up into the pandemic, there were a lot of things that we were just saying yes to. Yeah, we'll do that. Yeah, we'll take that job. And I think the pandemic was a great time for us to reflect on the things that we were taking on and how it was making us feel. If it was paying us enough, if we were given time to actually recover, all those important things that I think prior to the pandemic, we were just grateful for the job. Not saying that we're not grateful, but I think what we're starting to see, especially in my generation and younger, a lot of artists are now questioning certain things and asking, well, is this sustainable? Is this something that's going to benefit me? Do they care about my needs? You know, and I think it's great. These are great questions we need to be asking because artists do get abused and overworked. And I think that was the beautiful moment of artists coming together in that way and sharing the space. You know, I was on many Zoom calls. My husband knows about this with just other dancers. We were picking our brains and seeing how we can create change in a way that's more effective and sustainable and creates space and time for us to rest and heal our bodies. Because a lot of times when you come and see a show, we're pushing through injuries, we're pushing through someone died in our family, and there comes a point where you have to say, I need a minute. I need to take a day. I need to take 3 days off. I need to take a week off. And I think that was very different for generations before mine, where they just pushed through everything.
Yeah, and the other thing is directly asking for money, which lets me remind you that we want to support our artists. So make sure you check out that QR code. I think we forget, you know, that art just sort of appears, right? It just shows up. But in fact, much blood, sweat, and tears and hours go into that. And I think we often don't fairly compensate artists. And please give us your question or comment.
Yes, hi, I'm Olga Kagan. So we have a number of nurses here in the room also. And as you're talking about, you know, the trauma, the recovery, I think as healthcare professionals, we're another segment of population that I think were affected. And when I was watching the film, you know, I was thinking about how we are living in a very high-tech and low-touch environment now, right? And even though we do have technical solutions to help us bridge some of those problems that we're experiencing through creation of these online communities or WhatsApp groups, et cetera, to bring people together so they're not lonely. But I think it's a fine balance as to how much technology and how we use technology to address some of those human conditions, loneliness, grief, recovery. And so I'm just wondering, and I know in your experience you shared a great example of bringing birthing mothers together through that community of WhatsApp group and create that support system. So what have you seen maybe in your other experiences?
Yeah, Jeremy, healthcare workers.
Healthcare workers, right. So we noticed that healthcare workers were under particularly stress, not the only ones, but you know, they didn't get to say no to exposures. They were often pulled from one job assignment into the front lines. So there was a lot of uncertainty, anxiety, and so on. So we had actually started working with Northwell Health just before the pandemic, which was great. There was a recognition loneliness is part of distress and so on. So then we say, okay, what can we do? And we actually developed creative arts-based programming that could be done in small groups. Now, we used visual arts.
Can you give us an example of what that would look like?
Sure. So imagine, in the exercise, we would almost always have people come together virtually, and then when things got safer, in person, to take a 6 by 6 inch piece of heavy cardstock and some oil pastel crayons, which are like regular wax-based crayons, but much more intense. And we would give them a prompt. Well, first, some kind of mindfulness exercise, because the stress levels were so high. They remain high, by the way. And so some kind of visualization exercise, breathing exercise, and so on, just to get people in the moment. But then the key to the exercise was inviting them to imagine something, right? So here's an example. Imagine an important person in your life. So then they kind of visualize that. And then imagine the feelings you have of that person. Just imagine the feelings. So they imagine those. And then translate the feelings into color and put the color on the page. So you're not drawing the person. You're not drawing the feelings. You're drawing or using color to express the feelings. And you give people some time to do that. This is a fairly standard art therapy, creative exercise. But where the magic then happens is we would first split them up as pairs, as dyads, and say, share your story with each other. And there was something about the purposeful linking together of imagination, of allowing yourself to feel feelings and then translating the feelings, probably akin to what was going on there in using movement to translate poetry, that unlocked storytelling, because that's a fundamental way we connect to each other and to ourselves. In terms of the universal path to healing, by the way, I think that's when we get to a collective story about our trauma. So that does take a while. But then in this exercise, people just have this social conversation, and then we ask anybody who wants to share it, and they talk about it. And then we take all of these individual pieces of art and put them together as a collage so that you can see where your 6x6-inch square fits into the made feelings and the stories of others. And as simple as that is, because you really want to take it to scale. You want not just the nursing staff, but everybody in the hospital is traumatized. The transport people are traumatized. The people receiving, people at the front desk are traumatized. So that's the kind of approach where it takes it from individual therapy to almost of a public health campaign. Mm-hmm. And this is achievable. It's relatively low cost. You think, oh, people are going to say, I don't want to do it. Everyone wants to do it. Everything got, every time we would offer one of these, we would have more takers than we had space.
Reminds me a bit of the AIDS quilt. For those of you who remember back in the day when people were struggling with yet another, epidemic and crisis, one of the ways that people responded was by making your individual square for someone and then putting them together. Mm-hmm. And you would not have believed that quilting would turn Congress around. And when they put that quilt out on the National Mall, that was a striking thing that you just wouldn't have thought of quilting and political action. Remember those T-shirts like the ladies, sewing circle and terror society, but this is actually it. This is taking into sort of direct action from, the simple act of sewing. That's really fascinating. In fact, that kind of brings back to the topic of tonight, which is creativity and healing. We sort of hear this sort of these woo-woo, things, some internet star is going to talk about that. But I'm really interested in the actuality of it. Melissa is a creative arts therapist who unfortunately can't be here, but what she explained to us in our event that we had online, it's not just doing, hey, let's do some artwork, which is of course fun and relieving for people, but using the arts as the way to do mental health therapy. And what struck me about that, and I think Paige can probably talk about that, but there's sometimes a moment when an artist gets to a certain point in a piece of music or their dance where there's just, you have gotten into the depths, maybe more than you planned to. That can be a little bit scary. But there's a digging in deep that artists will talk about, and of course that's what makes great art, and that's how we distinguish that from, just run-of-the-mill, mass production stuff. There's that difference. And that sort of way to get into that plane of vulnerability is something that creative arts therapy then allows patients to use that moving through to deal with some of the things that are their issues. And maybe, Paige, can you tell us a bit about what is it like? You can call it the zone or the whatever, but when there's all the rehearsal and the standard moves, but then there's just something else that happens.
I think that moment is when you surrender and you get lost in the moment. You're no longer thinking about spacing and who are you going to bump into and costume issues, but you're really just present in the experience. And I think I definitely saw that happen in the film with the artists, that sense of vulnerability that's required as an artist to really just go there. And it's almost as if you're, a teacher of mine said, dancing on the edge, right? You know, there's a trust in your technique and your artistry so that you can soar. And that almost has to just happen through practice and trusting yourself. And I think right now, the season that I'm in, being a swing, it's really tested that, because I know all these parts and I can be thrown on at any moment, and there has to be a release of control because you're jumping in, you know, and it's the preparation prior, the rehearsals, the homework that you do before you get to the theater that makes you feel confident to be able to just go there and surrender.
So dancing on the edge sounds risky, right? In order to get there, you have to take some risk. And I'm wondering, Jeremy or Lucy, when you talk about creativity and healing, to really sort of get there, how much of a risk do people have to take?
So it's a really important point. So if you want to connect with other people, the big risk you have to take is to tolerate the discomfort of disclosure. You have to say something authentic and real about yourself, or other people can't recognize you and connect to you. Now, the good news is the arts are a very powerful catalyst to invite people to do that.
Why are they?
Okay, so there's a book coming out on October 3rd. I'll keep it really short.
Go.
No, I think, first of all, I think loneliness is the most human emotion. It's the gap between the connections to others that we aspire to, and what we feel we have. And everyone has that emotion at one time or another. Now, it's a problem when that emotion and that gap gets too deep or sustained. And serious toxic loneliness is probably the biggest preventable risk factor for depression, for addiction, for suicidality, and it increases physical health problems and early mortality by 30%, increases risk of heart attack, stroke, type 2 diabetes, and dementia. So we really don't want to be excessively lonely, but what do we do about it? So I think where the arts are incredibly powerful is giving us three things. First of all, arts impact the brain. There's incredible evidence now that making art or even beholding art, like watching that beautiful film, reduces our stress levels and changes our social cognition. If you do a functional MRI scan and see which parts of the brain illuminate, it's the same part that represent what's called the social connectome. When we meet people or see people on the street, do we see them as an opportunity or a threat? And it moves people to seeing connection with others as an opportunity. So that's the first thing. Creative arts change our brains in ways that open the door to empathy and engagement. But the second, and I think this is where a lot of the creative, expressive work is powerful, it invites you to tell your story. We all have a story. That's when you get to reveal your secret truth about yourself, what you might feel you need to be forgiven for in order to be loved, right? So we all carry this with us. And and the arts just invite you to find that story, shape that story, and share that story to another person. And they get to receive that, see you, acknowledge you, and share their story back. So that's the second way the arts connect. The third is all these stories of grief, of loss, of victory, of celebration connect us to the bigger human story, what Carl Jung called the collective unconscious. And that's, I think, ultimately how we heal from these big social tragedies, by recognizing that our story is actually linked to other people's stories, and we're not alone. So the arts are there. They've been around for thousands of years. Now the question is, how do we embrace them in a way that could make us healthier and well? And I think as tough as the pandemic was, it woke up a lot of people, that we've got to be doing something at a social and societal level. And you see it beginning to take shape. The fact that we're here tonight having this conversation is part of that.
Thank you. I'm going to invite the audience.
Hi, I'm also a nurse, and I'm a senior scholar in residence here at NIM. I want to ask the panel, I'm concerned that we're not going to recover well, that we're going to go back to the way it was and not take the learnings that we might have had. And I want to ask the panel that I think it has something to do with what you mentioned about one of the core tenets of the American culture is the individualism. And it's clear that we've lost trust in each other. And in order to integrate, we've got to feel safe, psychologically safe. We've got to feel that somebody does hear us. And our policies, not only in healthcare, I mean, we had a lot of terrible decisions, short-term decisions that were made with long-term adverse effects, some of which could have been predicted and were not. And there was nothing that the frontline workers could do about it. It's the same in schools. We now have the arts being eliminated, music out, PE out. Where's the integration? So what are we going to do about policies that the government is making and that we are just, I mean, I know there's not much we can do. It's depressing. What are we going to do about the schools and about the policies that we have to live with?
Well, thank you. Those are huge questions, and I'll let the panel off the hook for solving all of them. It might be above everyone's collective pay grade, but one thing is, what I observed in the pandemic is that healthcare workers, it was an interesting moment for all of us. I think a lot of the outside world had no idea what it was that people do in hospitals and healthcare, and all of a sudden had a bit of a view, and for a while, some appreciation. That 7 p.m. cheer, I loved both hearing it and participating in it. It was not just fun, but it was meaningful in this very deep way. And I think that we in healthcare, we accrued a certain amount of currency. Some got lost with mistrust, but I think it's still there. And I'm not talking about the healthcare sort of decision makers, but the people that patients actually see, their nurses, their doctors, their therapists, the people who push the gurney, people who greet them in the hospital. Those are the people that most people interact with. And I think if you ask them, people may say, oh, I don't trust anything. But then what about your doctor? Oh, yeah, I like my doctor, right? On the individual level. And that, because we have this unique ability to connect one-on-one. And so I think we do have some avenues there. And I don't know if, Lucy, if that at all is anything that you want to speak to, how we in healthcare or in the arts can use our individual connections to restore some of that.
Sure. I think a lot comes to mind about that. I think that to be honest, I've always been not skeptical exactly, but when people say the word community, I always think to myself, but what does that actually mean, right? Because a group of people can be hostile, violent, aggressive, push people to the outside. There's all sorts of ways that a community could be helpful or harmful. So I've always thought to myself, and maybe it's just because I'm a very introverted person, I always think to myself, why would I join a group? What's that group gonna be doing? I think to myself, if we pull down what community actually means, as a psychiatrist, I think to myself, I think what that's answering is the human need to be seen. And I think that that's the basis of community. I think that, to your point about policy, it's interesting. I actually became more interested in policy decisions when I thought about things on a one-to-one level. When I thought to myself, what is going to help me as a parent, and what are the things that are going to help my patients be seen on a one-to-one level? Then I think to myself, why don't we have a federal paid family leave program? Because everybody going back to work 2 weeks after they've given birth is inhumane, it's violent, and it breaks the bond of a family. So nobody's going to get seen when they're exhausted and pulled in too many different directions. So then we have to be collectively using our power to change policy. So for me, it really comes from the individual needs first, and then how does that blossom into a collective need?
And Jeremy, how does creativity play a role?
In connecting us, or?
In solving this problem.
Yeah, I think it's a combination of, we use the word creativity, there are lots of ways of thinking what that is, but I also think it's about imagination. It's actually imagining, because the world is in a very dire place now. You don't have to work very hard on the left side of your brain to add up all the things, right? If it's not just interpersonal crises, look at climate change. Look at all the things that seem like inexorable forces moving against our survival. So how do you push back against that and create a little bit of a window so that we can have conversations, imagine certain possibilities, and move forward with them? And I continue to come back to the power of curiosity to push back against despair. And I think curiosity and creativity are intertwined. You know, in every poem I write, it starts with being curious about some situation. Personal challenge, social issue, something happening to a friend. So it begins with that, and then you begin to work with that. How do you, and imagine other ways to explore, investigate, imagine strategies using whatever creative form you're in. So I do think it is, we use the word creativity a lot, just like, you know, we use the word community a lot. Sometimes it's good to put a little pressure on these words so that we can kind of get down to the bottom of things.
Thank you. What's your comment or question?
How are you? My name is Andy. I'm a dance movement psychotherapist. Licensed
Come closer into the mic. Yeah.
Oh, can you hear me? I want to first thank this audience member for expressing herself so passionately.
Yeah.
I really felt what you were saying. Thank you. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about, as practitioners, as psychiatrists, how are you, what do you do in this case of when there's loneliness? Are we now prescribing for loneliness? Like, what are the ethics around that? You know, having this information and knowing that that's what the root cause. How do you address that in your practice? And also, are you aware of these new arts on prescription models, prescribing like arts experience? Maybe you're referring to a creative arts therapist as well. Where are you at that with those?
That's a great question, and so Lucy's a psychiatrist. Jeremy and I are primary care doctors, and I think a lot about the UK as the model of social prescribing. And so I start to ask my patients what they do, what do you do for fun? What's your hobby? Do you have a hobby? And some people don't, but many people do, or they did. They'll say, oh, when I was a kid, I used to. I hear that all the time. And so one of the things I am trying to do is to sort of nudge them toward that. Whether it's they never got their GED. I had a patient today who I was, finished 11th grade and thought, not only do I know that education and health outcomes, parallel each other, but there's a communal part to completing your education. So I do think it's really part of it. Going to the senior center, the community center, the ballroom dancing. I do start to ask a lot. And the other thing is that it is physical activity often, and for our mainly sedentary population, that's my surrogate for getting people, off their rears and out moving. Lucy, how about you?
It's something that I've struggled with a lot, honestly, as a psychiatrist, because I think to myself, am I prescribing a medication for a socially driven problem? And it is a dilemma that I've wrestled with. I think that where I come down is that for me as a physician first, I think to myself, my job is to help to relieve suffering. And so if there's suffering, that's what I'm going to address. And so so I was actually recently asked a couple of times about a brand new medication for postpartum depression. Just came out. You might have read about it. It was in Vogue. It was in the New York Times. And I was asked about, is this going to be the magic pill that fixes postpartum depression? And I thought, and what I said in answer to that, I said, well, a pill is not a federal family leave policy, right? That it's both and. I personally think like the foundation of all arts is the idea of a story. I don't know if you guys would agree with that, and I'll leave that to the current professional artist in the room. But I really think that the major impulse of all art is the story. When I co-founded this company to have women give birth on teams. One of the things that I did is I had every single member say their birth story, and then I actually created a visual of them, of a photograph, and then a linear representation of their birth story. Because a lot of what people said was that, God, you know, I give birth and then I'm discharged 12 hours later, and like, okay, right?
Story's over.
Story's over, right? And they were like, I just went through the most transformative experience of my life, and now I get discharged, and it just felt very, very, we're lacking ritual. We're lacking a way to gather. We're lacking a sense that we have commonalities through the chapters of our lives. And I do think that that's what art gets to.
Boy, art comes into that. I'm going to, before you get to Paige, just give people a heads up that we'll draw to close soon. So if you have a question, come on up. Paige, as an artist, where do you see your role as in the healing aspect of the community?
Advocating, speaking up, more than I want to these days. You know, I think right now we have 2 dancers in the show who are pregnant, and seeing how they had to, you know, look into the policy and look into what was allowed, and seeing that they're now allowed to take FLOA, which is family leave of absence, and Disney is bringing in an understudy to cover their time away. I think that's beautiful, that shift is happening. But I agree with this woman's frustration. It's, you know, at times it seems like we're just going back to what we were doing before the pandemic, and I think we just need to continue to use our voice in any way that we can. Write an email, you know, speak to the people that have the power to create change, and sometimes that's you. And it's scary, and, you know, but I definitely think for me as an artist, what I've been able to do is just observe what I don't like and kind of suggest better options in that way, in a way that's still professional, but still very, very clear.
Thank you. Question from the audience.
Well, it's not really a question.
Comment.
It's more of a comment. My name is Christopher Bailey. I'm with the World Health Organization. I am the lead for the Arts and Health program
You
there.
pick the mic just up a little bit because you're so tall.
I guess being tall is one of my shortcomings.
Just speak into it. Yeah.
I was kind of taken aback by the notion of creativity being a cure or a treatment for loneliness, because I think it's actually part and parcel of what loneliness is. I go back to Carl Jung and his quote, "Loneliness is not the absence of people. Loneliness is the inability to express what matters to you most." And so it's not that creativity can help this other thing called loneliness. Loneliness is the inability to express. And there can be many reasons for that. There can be an unequal power relationship. There can be a physical disability. There could be the fact that in your situation, you can't find the words. So can you find the sound? Can you find the gesture? Can you find the way of framing an image that can express what it is that you would want people to hear? And so, to me, I get worried when we over-medicalize these things and we say, oh, creativity is a social prescription and we have to apply it to this problem, and there's a one-on-one relationship there, a causal effect. Creativity is part of what makes us human. And being part of a community is part of what makes us human. And I think both of them are frankly intertwined, and our neurobiology reflects that. When we are in the deep aesthetic experience and we hear a song and we sing together, and that line of music builds an anticipation, creating the dopamine effect, and then finally we come to the conclusion and we have the hormonal effect that creates the bonding between us. That's part of the woof and warp of our soul. Anyway.
Yeah, I think well, thank you. That's a great observation. And actually, so maybe then our role is not to apply creativity, but to help bring it come forth. Because if you think about it, every child is an instinctive artist, right?
Exactly.
Kids have no problem being an amazing artist at sometimes the highest level. And yet somehow, when they're adults, we have trouble with that. And somewhere along the line, we lose that ability to draw anywhere, sing at the top of your lungs, parade around, perform in the living room. We all do that. Kids do that instinctively with no training, no issues. So maybe, Jeremy, that's what our job is?
Well, it depends on maybe where you stand on that, depends on where you sit. So I actually made a career transition away from internal medicine into public health, in part to address issues like this that I think have deep social and cultural, call them roots, causes, and so on. And I think it's a mistake to over-pathologize certain things. And as wonderful as it is, I think that our Surgeon General, I have tremendous respect for, has risen. He has kind of heightened the awareness and attention on loneliness. He came up with a big Health and Human Services advisory on loneliness. This is fantastic in a way. We now have attention on it. But what happens, the challenge of pathologizing something is people start viewing themselves as sick if they have it. And I'll go back to what I said. I love that Carl Jung quote. I think, yes, creativity makes us human. Community makes us human. I think loneliness makes us human. I think the challenge is to learn how to navigate it. And so I think a public health model is actually more useful, and not to make it overly complicated. Imagine a pyramid. We call it the pyramid of vulnerability for loneliness, and it's got 3 tiers: bottom tier, mid-tier, top tier. The bottom tier is all of us. All of us have some loneliness sometime. And at that tier, what we should be doing is educating people, right? Talk about what is loneliness. What's the difference between being lonely and being alone? If you ask a lot of people, they're fuzzy about this. Being alone is such a fantastically important human experience that opens the door to deep insight into yourself and to maybe some of the answers to these tough questions. It's such an important experience. We have a fancy word for it. We call it solitude, right? So we don't want to pathologize solitude. So that's the bottom tier. And that's where we can have some very effective, call it public health campaigning, social determinant of health education. We should be having conversations like this at all levels, all strata, across all demographics. But still, life is complicated, it's challenging, things happen that then move you from the bottom tier to the middle tier. So this is critical. So it could be you get sick, serious illness, you lose your job, you break up from a relationship. There are many things that destabilize our sense of connection to self and others. The critical thing when you move into that middle tier is prompt recognition and beginning to address it with some kind of healthy connecting type activity. It does not require intensive medical therapy. It requires conversations. Tell your story. Make art with someone so that that story can be amplified and a force to connect. So this is the middle tier. Because the big thing to worry about with loneliness that we've seen is something called spiraling. So as you start getting lonely, you withdraw from the world. The world starts looking like a scarier and less friendly place as you get lonely. So what do? You withdraw even more. And then people don't know how to connect with you, they withdraw from you. And so this is a spiral. And the way to interrupt that spiral is right when people move into that mid-tier. Now, you're not always successful. There is a top tier of people who are toxically disconnected. These are the people at risk for suicide, addiction, other kind of serious challenges. That is a medical issue, and that needs to be recognized. But it's not the same as people navigating the very human challenge of loneliness. So I think we can address it, but if we think what's going to fix loneliness is the enlightened intervention of basically a handful of clinicians, that's not going to work anyway.
Yeah. Thank you. Question from the audience or comment?
Hi, my name is Nina. I have been a nurse since 2009 in New York City for the major health systems, Presbyterian and Northwell. And I just want to thank all of you because this is one of the more engaging and interesting events that I've been to. I'm also a patient. I'm bipolar since 2016, 17, and I've also worked in war zones. So I've gone through COVID as a nurse supervisor, through Ebola, and we could talk for hours about all the policies and other things. I also am an artist. I write, play music, and do poetry. So I think this is one of the ways to open up this path to change all of the, and somewhat ignore what you don't think you can change, right? Regarding the loneliness part and solitude, it took me a long time, 2 hospitalizations in the city for mania and suicidal depression. Actually, I got discharged right before COVID hit, and then I went into work as a nurse administrator.
Oh my God.
But in time, I've learned to embrace this solitude. It's uncomfortable at first, but now I quite enjoy it. And I've been very lucky to have been surrounded by a lot of people who recognize when that's what I need or when something needs to be, an intervention is required. So there's a lot to talk about, but this is one way to start the conversation and, like you said, share your story. And also not focus so much on things that we can't change. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great way. One last comment from the audience, then we'll wrap up.
Hi, thank you for this program. My name is Irene. You mentioned the isolation of a person who's ill, that in spite of good medical care and the support of family and friends, they still have this isolating experience of the illness, which often these forms of help don't penetrate. But some people feel that less and are able to disengage from this overwhelming sense of illness. And I was wondering what factors you've seen in your practice that enable some individuals not to feel their illness so heavily, so that, do they connect with other people with the same illness so that it sort of alleviates the sense of victimhood or the awfulness of what they're experiencing? But I'm just curious, in your own practice.
Thank you. That's a great question. Well, we'll answer that briefly. Yeah, go ahead, Paige.
I can chime in with being someone who has scoliosis. And I remember when I was first diagnosed at the age of 13, how isolating and terrifying that felt. I thankfully had loving parents and support system to move through that, and found a great doctor and physical therapist, but the initial shock of it, and we didn't have Instagram and Facebook to connect and for me to find out that there were other professional dancers with scoliosis. But as I've gotten older and through the Paige Fraser Foundation, what I've found has helped is creating programs where I can connect with other people. And Spine Series, which I mentioned earlier, was created during the pandemic because I was physically in pain. I went from dancing every day to sitting around. We were living in a studio apartment. There was not much I could do but like yoga, right? And I remember presenting this idea to the board of like offering Spine Series virtually, and to see how many people signed up. We had instructors who also had scoliosis, and they had their network. But what was so beautiful was seeing all those faces on Zoom of other people who had been going through what I had been going through. And it's not that we were lonely, right? We felt alone in that moment because everything had just been disconnected, right? I couldn't go to Pilates class like I used to. I couldn't go take dance. So I definitely think that was one of the biggest cures for me, was connecting and finding other people during the pandemic that were also itching to move and heal their body and their spine.
Thank you. Jeremy or Lucy, you want to briefly comment on why some patients seem a little more protected from that?
The reality of the situation, I think, as we all know, is you're born, you thrive, you dwindle, you die. That's if you're lucky you get to see all of those phases. And that's just how it is. And then how do we make it okay? that that's how it is. And that is one of the big struggles. And I think essential to navigating that struggle is to allow your life, your ego, your story to be part of a bigger story.
Yeah, definitely. And I think we will close on that existential note. A real thank you to everyone. A real thank you to our panelists, Lucy Hutner, Paige Fraser-Hoffman, Jeremy Nobel. Thank you. I just want a quick acknowledgement to New York Academy of Medicine, Connor Bellis, who runs the Fellows Program, the AV staff, Dave Kuroga, our film staff here is helping out, but a real super shout out to, again, the staffs of VLR and TPFF here, but especially Linda Lombardi and Lesma Fraser, who are on both boards, who did the heavy lifting. And, you know, if you saw how many parts went to the film, there's even 50 more of those to come to the event. So get some food. Please take all those journals, man. We're not carrying them home, so take as many as you want. Grab some food, grab postcards, pay an artist, and we'll see you at the next event. Thank you so much.
Yes, please do.